To live what ASFA calls a comfortable retirement in Australia in 2026, a couple needs $77,375 a year. That is the number everyone quotes. Type how much you need invested to live off dividends in Australia into any search bar, and you will find the same spreadsheet, the same tidy return, the same picture of two happy retirees on a boat. Here is what almost none of those spreadsheets tell you. About 1 in 7 Australians over 65 are renting, not sitting in a paid-off house. If you are one of them, that $77,375 figure is not just optimistic, it is wrong by tens of thousands of dollars a year, because it assumes your rent is $0. I have watched people run these numbers for their own retirement and feel relieved, because $1,406,818 sounded doable. Then they remembered they still pay rent every month, and the relief drained out of the room fairly fast. So today we are doing the maths properly. We are building what I will call the rent-adjusted dividend target, the real number a renter needs sitting in dividend-paying shares before they can walk away from work for good. For a couple renting instead of owning, a comfortable retirement does not cost $1,406,818. It is closer to $2,073,364 once you add the true cost of a lease into the equation. If that number just made your stomach drop, stay with me. The gap between your current super balance and $2,073,364 is not the end of the story. There is a second mechanism, one built into the age pension itself. That actually works harder in your favor if you do not own a home. I am going to walk you through it, along with a way to protect your dividend income so a bad year on the ASX never forces you to sell shares at the worst possible moment. According to ASFA, the retirement standard for a comfortable lifestyle in 2026 sits at $54,840 a year for a single person and $77,375 a year for a couple. Those figures come from real surveys of what retirees spend on food, health cover, insurance, and a modest amount of travel. They are solid numbers. The problem is what they leave out. ASFA builds that standard on the assumption that you own your home outright, with no rent and no mortgage sitting on top of everyday costs. If you are renting instead, that assumption breaks the whole calculation. Cotality's rental review for the June quarter of 2026 put the national median advertised rent at $705 a week. Multiply that out across a year, and you get $36,660 an expense. The comfortable standard simply does not include anywhere in its maths. Add that back in, and a couple's real target moves from $77,375 to $114,035 a year. That is not a rounding error. That is an extra $36,660 in income your investments need to produce every single year for as long as you are living in that rental. Here is where the maths gets uncomfortable. Most people work out their number by taking the income they want and dividing it by the yield they expect their shares to pay, often around 5.5% once franking credits are counted. Run that on the standard figure, and $77,375 divided by 5.5% comes out to $1,406,818. Run the exact same formula on the rent-adjusted figure, and $114,035 divided by 5.5% comes out to $2,073,364. Same yield, same method. The only thing that changed is whether rent was part of the equation. This is not about anyone failing to buy a house. Plenty of people arrive at 60 renting because of a divorce, a business that did not work out, or a career that started late in life. What rarely gets said out loud is that rent does not politely stay still while you are retired. Dividends tend to grow a few percent a year. In cities like Sydney or Brisbane, rent has grown faster than that for long stretches, which means a portfolio sized only for today's rent can fall behind within a few years of leaving work. That's the part nobody puts on the spreadsheet. If you size your portfolio only for the rent you are paying right now, you are not just short today. You are signing up for a shortfall that gets a little wider every time your lease renews. So if $2,073,364 feels like a mountain you cannot see the top of, hold that thought. There is a second lever most renters do not know they are holding, and it comes from how the age pension actually treats people who do not own a home. Here is the part almost nobody explains properly. Not owning a home does not only cost you money. Under the assets test that applies from the 1st of July 2026, Services Australia gives non-homeowners a materially higher threshold before your age pension starts shrinking compared with someone who owns their home outright. To put a figure on it, from that date, a homeowner couple keeps the full age pension while their assessable assets sit under $499,000 and a single homeowner has that line drawn at $333,000. The family home itself does not count in either case. So a homeowner already has an asset worth hundreds of thousands of dollars sitting outside the test entirely. A renter does not get that exemption, so the system compensates by moving the non-homeowner threshold up, giving you more room to hold a larger share portfolio while still drawing a full pension. Picture the letter that lands in a homeowner's letterbox once a year, just a council rates notice. A renter's letterbox gets a lease renewal instead, and that letter changes the number due far more often. That is not charity. It is the test recognizing that a renter needs their investments doing double duty, covering everyday living, and the rent a homeowner simply does not pay. So instead of chasing the full $2,073,364 dividend portfolio entirely on your own, there is a smarter target. Call it the Pension Plus Dividend Bridge. Rather than trying to fund all $114,035 a year purely from shared dividends, you size a portfolio to sit in the sweet spot of the assets test, one that still qualifies you for a meaningful age pension. That pension is inflation indexed and government guaranteed, which is exactly the kind of steady floor a renter needs, sitting underneath a dividend income that can wobble in a bad year. Your dividends only need to cover the gap between what the pension pays and what your rent and living costs actually require, which is a far smaller number to build toward. I used to tell people flat out to buy a home before anything else, no exceptions. Looking at where rents and pension settings sit in 2026, I do not say that quite so automatically anymore. For some people, a large dividend portfolio sitting inside super turns out to be more flexible than owning a house would have been, because you can draw an income from it without ever having to sell the roof over your head. This mix comes with its own balancing act. Lean too hard on the pension, and you become dependent on a payment that future political decisions could tighten. Lean too hard on dividends alone, and you lose the inflation protection the pension gives you for free. The point of the bridge is not picking one over the other. It is building a mix where each side can absorb a shock the other side cannot. If you are starting to see how renting could actually work in your favor, here subscribe, because we build these unconventional retirement plans regularly for the sort of household that does not fit the standard spreadsheet. But there is a serious hole in this plan if we stop here. What happens to that dividend income the day the share market has a bad year? Right after you have already handed in your notice at work. In 2020, when the pandemic hit, several of the big Australian banks did exactly what a lot of retirees assumed dividend shares would never do. They cut or deferred their dividend payments, some by close to 50%, inside the space of a single year. If your whole retirement plan assumed those payments would arrive like clockwork, that year would have blown a hole straight through it. This is what planners call sequence of returns risk, and it matters more in your first year out of work than almost any other year. A share market fall of around 20% in year one of retirement, paired with a dividend cut on top of it, can shorten how long a portfolio lasts by well over a decade, compared with the exact same fall happening 10 years into retirement. The maths is identical either way. The timing is what changes everything. That one detail is why two retirees holding identical portfolios and spending identical amounts can end up in completely different financial positions a decade later, based purely on which year the market decided to fall. I've seen retirees find this out the hard way, opening a statement in early 2020 to see their dividend income cut by half in the same month. Their car rego renewal and health insurance premium landed in the letterbox. Nothing about their spending had changed. The only thing that changed was when the market decided to wobble. Here is why timing hits a renter harder than a homeowner. A homeowner with no mortgage can absorb a bad year quietly because their housing cost that month is still $0. A renter cannot do that. Rent is due no matter what the ASX did last quarter, and if your dividends just got cut, the only way to find that rent is selling shares while the price is down. Every share sold at a low price is a share that cannot recover when the market does, and cannot pay you a dividend next year either. That is the death spiral. A smaller portfolio produces a smaller income, which forces you to sell more, which shrinks the portfolio again. This is exactly why treating dividends as your only income source is risky once you are past 60, and no longer earning a wage to fall back on. You need something sitting between the share market and your landlord that never has to be sold at the wrong moment, no matter how the news is describing the economy that month. So how do you build that buffer without needing a $3 million balance sitting untouched? That is the dual track approach, and it starts with the least exciting account you will ever open. The first track is what I call your landlord insurance. Though there is no actual insurance policy involved, it is simply 24 months of rent sitting in a high-interest savings account, or your mortgage offset if you still have one, kept completely separate from your share portfolio. When a year like 2020 happens and dividends drop, you draw your rent from that bucket instead of selling shares at the bottom. That single decision is what stops the death spiral before it starts, because your portfolio gets a full 2 years to recover before you are forced to touch it again. 2 years sitting in cash might sound like it is doing nothing, but most dividend cuts and market falls have historically clawed back within that window, which is exactly why the bucket does not need to be any bigger than that to do its job. The second track is about squeezing more out of every dollar already invested. A lot of the big Australian share funds built around bank and business dividends carry franking credits attached to those payments. A cash yield of 4% on paper can effectively become close to 5.7% once those franking credits are added back, because the company paying the dividend has already handed 30% of that profit to the tax office before it ever reached you. If you are drawing that income inside super, where the tax rate on withdrawals after 60 is 0%, that extra 1.7% is not a rounding error. It is money the tax office refunds you for tax the company already paid, and most retirees never claim the difference because nobody ever explained it to them. The third track is closing the gap between where you are now and that target as fast as legally possible. For the 2026 to 2027 financial year, the concessional contributions cap sits at $32,500, up from $30,000 the year before. If your total super balance sits under $500,000, you can also carry forward unused cap space from the previous 5 years. Picture someone at 58 who has only been putting in $15,000 a year for the last 3 years, well under the old caps. Under the carry-forward rule, that person could have tens of thousands of dollars in unused space available in a single financial year, all taxed going in at 15% instead of their regular marginal rate. None of these three tracks is complicated on its own. What matters is running them together, the cash bucket protecting the dividends, the franking credits lifting the yield, and the extra contributions closing the gap faster than saving alone could ever manage. Even once all three tracks are running, there is a very human obstacle that trips people up long before the maths does. Here is the part almost nobody talks about, because it has nothing to do with maths. When a friend mentions their paid-off house at a barbecue, something in your chest tightens, even when your own numbers are perfectly fine. That reaction has a name, loss aversion mixed with social comparison, and it pushes a lot of otherwise sensible people toward high-yield shares, promising 10% or more, chasing a number that feels like it closes the gap with the homeowners standing around the table. Those double-digit yields rarely hold up, and reaching for them out of a sense of falling behind usually costs more in the long run than the shame it was trying to fix. If you feel a flicker of anxiety about not having a paid-off house behind you, that is a completely normal reaction, not a sign you have done something wrong. A portfolio worth $1,500,000 is just as real as a house worth the same amount. The difference is you cannot walk through a share portfolio and touch the walls, so it never quite feels as solid, even when the numbers say otherwise. One small habit change helps more than people expect. Stop checking what your portfolio is worth every day. Start checking what it actually paid you in dividends each quarter instead. Share prices bounce around for reasons that have nothing to do with your retirement. The income those shares produce is the number that actually pays your rent, and it moves far less than the price ever does. We have redone the comfortable retirement number for renters, moving it from $77,375 to $114,035 a year once rent is properly counted. We have used the 2026 age pension assets, test to work in your favor rather than against you, and built a 2-year cash bucket, so a bad year on the ASX never forces you to sell shares at the worst possible moment. Retirement was never really one spreadsheet that applies to everyone the same way. Whether you own your home or you rent it, the goal underneath all of this maths stays the same: having enough coming in that you get to choose how your days actually look. Subscribe to Aussie Retirement with Bob if this is the kind of retirement planning you have been looking for, the sort built for people whose numbers do not match the standard example. You have worked a long time for this money. Let's make sure it can cover the rent.